Aisuebeogun. Please help me celebrate Dr. Richard.
Thank you very much. I'm going to stand on the existing protocol, but I want to recognize the Honorable Minister of Tourism present with us here this morning, and every distinguished ladies and gentlemen in the audience. It is indeed my pleasure to present this paper titled Liberalization of African Skies, the Way Forward. So the key discussion is the way forward. What is known is that African skies has been liberalized in the last couple of years. In fact, in the last 30 years. However, what have we achieved? And if we have not achieved the dream of the founding fathers of the liberalized African skies, what then do we need to do to achieve that? Well, first of all, let's appreciate the continent Africa. So we know where we're coming from, and then we know where we are and where we want to go. So from the north to the south in Cape Town, it's about 8,000 kilometers in length. And from the east, and when we talk about the east, we're looking at not the Horn, but Mombasa in Kenya, down to Cape Verde in the west, it's about 7,400 kilometers in width. That's Africa for you. It has a total landmass of about 11.7 million square meters. Very interesting. And interestingly, Africa has second largest population in the world, 1.46 billion people. And of course, you know that Africa is made up of about 54, 55 countries in Africa. So it's a huge continent, huge potential market, economic market. Now, if you have this mental picture, the question then is, how well have air transports been harnessed in Africa and contribute to the growth of Africa? Clearly, air transport, interestingly, compared to the other mode of transportation in Africa, has a stronger advantage. And that's what we all must appreciate, because if you're going to go by rail from the south end in Cape Town all the way down to somewhere in Casablanca, definitely it will take us days. And if you're going to go from somewhere here in Cape Verde, just after Dakar in Senegal, all the way down to somewhere here in the Horn, or around Mombasa in Kenya, it will take us days. But if you're going to do that by air, you can be sure that, like every other part of the world, you will get to your destination within 24 hours by air. And of course, within Africa, you get to your destination on an average 8-10 hours across the continent. So that tells us the vital and the importance of air transport in Africa. But have we harnessed it? The potential we have? The answer is no. Why do we say so? We're going to see a number of reasons why we're saying this. Now, the major constraint for the growth of intra-African growth, especially for air transport, is essentially the slow pace of liberalization. So, like I said at the onset, African air transport had been liberalized nearly 3 decades ago. However, the implementation has been very slow among the 54 countries. And you're going to see some data which I will show us. Now, apart from the slow pace of liberalization, there is the over-dependence, and this is very key, on the BASA agreements that is signed between countries, as well as certain key variables that drive the success of air transport, such as taxes. We find that taxes in many countries are higher, and they are so exorbitant that they discourage air transportation. Even passengers, when they look at the fares they have to pay, and they look at the components of those fares, and found that they have to pay more taxes, they are discouraged. Sometimes they just conclude and say, look, it's better I go by rail, or it's better I go by my car and drive all the way. Of course, other variables which involves the operating cost of running an airline, such as jet fuel and handling services, are pretty very expensive in Africa. Now, so basically, I'm going to focus on not just analyzing the liberalization of African skies, but how it can foster the economic growth, enhance connectivity within Africa, and then promote sustainable development across the continent. And ultimately, I'll just summarize with the way forward. So, in simple terms, when we say liberalization of African skies, we're talking about the process of removing or reducing restrictions and, of course, barriers to air transport within the African continent. And this is very key, because we may not see it, especially in your own part of the world. But it is when you begin to operate from one point to the other, what we call point A to point B to point C to point D, that you will begin to experience the restrictions and barriers limiting, of course, the operation of flights to various countries. And of course, this is as a result of, like we said, opening up the air routes, competitions among airlines, and the facilitation of free movement of passengers, including goods and services, by this mode we're discussing. So in the context of Africa, where we're very much concerned now, air transport infrastructure and the connectivities are very limited. Very, very limited. So it affects the liberalization effort that has been developed by the founding fathers of the Yamoussoukro decision 30 years ago. But these challenges are not limited to these three. You're going to see a number of challenges that actually limits the growth of air transport and the connectivities in air transport. The first one is the promotion of integration among African countries. The harmonization of regulatory frameworks. And this is very key, because every country have their own regulations. And these are civil aviation regulations that have been domesticated in the various state regulations. However, for these regulations to be applicable to every country, it has to be harmonized. Now, investment itself is very key. We have to encourage investment in aviation infrastructure, like every other sector of the economy. And in fostering collaboration among airlines and other stakeholders, obviously, aviation infrastructure is very key. So, what are the importance of connectivity, especially within Africa? I'll give you some data which will help us to appreciate where we are. Air transport is so unique to the socio-economic activities of people in the various countries, especially within Africa. And the reason is because we connect cities that cannot otherwise be connected. Among the 54 countries I showed you from the original earlier picture of Africa, there are some parts of Africa that you cannot have the mode of transport access. It might be very difficult to construct rail across some very hilly, mountainous region of Africa. But it's so easy for air to go in and out of this region. So, but can you imagine that $6 trillion worth of goods, which accounts for about 35% of international trade by its value, is moved across the entire world by air transport? Now, of this 6 trillion, interestingly, look at this. Countries with better connectivity tend to trade more. And 1% of this entire 35% international trade, it's on cargo. Cargo alone. Now, interestingly, if you look at the last point here, connectivity, obviously, if it is enhanced, will raise productivity. It will encourage investment It will encourage innovation, and of course, it will improve business operation and efficiency in the way we do things in our countries within the African continent. And I'll give you an example here. In 2021, 35% of African routes were operated daily. Take note of that. 35% of the entire African routes were operated daily. And only 13% were operated twice daily in the whole of Africa by the airlines operating within Africa. Now, within Africa itself, by 2020, there was a decline by 6%. This is very obvious, especially when we compare to 2019 data. The reason is because of the COVID-19 pandemic. We all know that. But we're not so worried about that because we knew that post the pandemic, air transport was going to grow. But we're concerned about how we will get up to where we were pre-pandemic, which was about 970 city pairs among countries within Africa. So let's look at the situation regarding the implementation of the instrument that was designed to help us achieve connectivity within Africa, which is the Yamoussoukro decision about 30 years ago. Now, the perspective to this is Yamoussoukro decision is to liberalize air transport in Africa. And this is very possible and it's doable, it's achievable, but only on one condition. If we have, I want us to please underline this, the full implementation of the Yamoussoukro decision. Because the problem we're having today is that we are unable to implement the full decisions. It's been partial implementation of the Yamoussoukro decision. From the studies I had when I got this paper, I realized that the problem is not implementation of the Yamoussoukro decision. A lot of countries in Africa have tried to, and you will see the data I'm going to show you now. However, they have implemented partial part of the decisions that were taken. But we also recognize the fact that if we are able to implement the full decisions of the Yamoussoukro decision, we'll be able to achieve the single African air transport market, SATA, which is an initiative of the African Union to enhance air transport growth in Africa. So the question then is, are we in Africa implementing the Yamoussoukro decision? Well, studies have been carried out by ICAO, IATA, AFRA, and even AFCAC. These are aviation bodies, Honorable Mr. Man. Now, the studies clearly shows that the Yamoussoukro decision is still partially implemented between the African states. And there's a need for implementation to fully realize the single African air transport market and enjoy the significance of the benefits of aviation to African economics. So, what are some of the challenges we're facing in the implementation of the Yamoussoukro decision? For instance, we have 5 freedom rights. Freedom 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This may be a bit technical for non-aviators, but for most of us in aviation, we know what these freedom rights are. I have avoided being too complex about it, so I just wanted us to appreciate that there are 5 freedom rights of the air. And these were contained in the Yamoussoukro decision 30 years ago. And they were said to be the operational success of the decision reached by the African countries. If air transport success was going to be achieved in Africa through liberalization, the 5th freedom right, 1 to 5 rights of freedom of air, must be implemented by all African countries. Unfortunately, that's not where we are. Now, for instance, we have over 600 BASA, and it was only when a compliance review of the 55 countries in Africa was done that we found that only 4 countries have the highest compliance in terms of the implementation of the 1 to 5 rights of freedom of air. And the countries are Cape Verde, they have 76% in terms of implementation, which is actually a pass mark from the study reports, and I'll show you the source of the study shortly. Mozambique has 75%, Mali had 73%, and Liberia has 71%. These are that are, so to say, near implementation of full decisions reached in the Yamoussoukro Decision Accord. Now, 30 countries are on the medium compliance and 20 countries are on the low compliance. So you may be wondering, where is Nigeria in all of this? Well, this is the data, and the source of the data is right at the end of this table. I'm not going to run through the whole table because of our time, but as you can see, we have the first 4 that have the high compliance, the rest are medium compliance, and when you go further, then you have the low compliance countries. But of course, if you come back here, this is where we are. This is Nigeria. 50%, so we are medium compliance. So what happens to the rest of the compliance required to fully implement the Yamoussoukro decision? Like many other African countries, foot dragging for some obvious reason. And one of the major reasons is protectionism. Everybody wants to cage and guard what they have. But the benefit of sharing and allowing is undermined when we think in that perspective. Now, so the source of this is the ICAO, and of course, a research conducted by IATA in the year 2020. So, 372 basins were discerned to be non-compliant. And of these, we have 105, which is about 28%. They failed to meet one of the prerequisites of the compliance. So take note of the 5. I mentioned the traffic rights. So the 5 traffic rights, take note, you have 28% that fail to meet just one of those prerequisites of the compliance. Now, on the other hand, we have 207 BASAs implemented, which is about 72%. Now, these ones fail to meet 1 or 2 of the same prerequisites of the Yamoussoukro decision. Sadly, almost all the non-compliance of the BASA, which is about 88%, were as a result of the fact that they failed to meet the 3rd, 4th, and 5th traffic rights. So it means that until, of course, we're able to meet the entire traffic rights, we are unable to implement fully the decision of the Yamoussoukro Accord to enhance connectivity and liberalize African air transport market among the countries of Africa. So the provision of the 3rd and the 4th traffic right is a major obstacle, towards the implementation of the Yamoussoukro decision in Africa. And each time we talk about Yamoussoukro decision, we're talking about the liberalization of African air transport market among the countries in Africa. Now, so what are the issues? I already mentioned one, protectionism. But critically, is the level of safety and severity in air transport in Africa. Then, of course, effective regulations among the countries in Africa. This is being handled, I must say, by AFCAC. AFCAC is the African Civil Aviation Association, and they are doing a good job. AFCAC is headed by a Nigerian, and I'm very proud of that, Ms. Funke Adeyemi. She's the Secretary General of AFCAC, and she's doing everything possible to ensure that regulation, civil aviation regulation within Africa, enhances air transport growth in Africa. Of course, our fleet sizes is very key. I wish George Uris is already here. This week, he was talking about alliances, global alliances, and he talked about conditions precedent to joining members of the 3 major global alliances. One of the conditions is fleet size. You don't just wake up and say you want to join Star Alliance. No. There are conditions you have to meet. Now, also, states are being audited, and the results of those audits have to be fully implemented primarily to ensure compliance to safety. And interestingly, out of the 55 states in Africa, only 22 were found to be below the safety threshold. And this is very sad. Sadly, more is the fact that 10 of these were members of the Single African Air Transport Market, those who have signed that, look, we will implement this. So one thing is to sign to be part of the Single African Air Transport Market. Another thing is to ensure that the severity reduced to the lowest level. And this is something that's key and central to liberalization in Africa. Okay, so we're saying that liberalization enhances air connectivity. Of course, it enhances and creates high socioeconomic growth. The implementation level of the Yamoussoukro decision and BASA compliance will impact negatively if it is not done fully. We're saying that out of the 607 BASA reviewed, 235, which is about 39%, were YD compliant, and 237, 61%, were non-compliant. And this is AFCAC 2020, African Civil Aviation Association Commission. So, sadly, when some members of the Single African Air Transport Market are partially implementing this, it shows that we're really not ready to liberalize Africa and African air transport in particular. So what are the challenges? The roads, the rails in Africa are not developed. Africa needs to take advantage of this air transport market to grow its economy. To achieve this, Africa needs to facilitate growth in terms of the two major obstacles limiting air transport growth. And this is one, high airfare. In the last 2, 3, 4, 5 months, maybe perhaps 1 year now, and President of NANTA is here, we've talked about high airfare, which has been a very limiting and a major challenge to many of us. Not because of the disposable income, but because the airfares were just not commensurate with the reality now. Of course, the free movement of people within Africa is also a key thing here. We're advocating for single African Union passport, just like you have the EU passport. We're saying if we have this, we will have limitless opportunities to move from point A to point B within the 55 African states. And this will enhance connectivity as well. Operating costs for airlines are key and major challenge. Many of these are exogenous costs, fuel costs, for instance, ground services costs, aircraft financing, whether it's wet lease or dry lease. These are major costs that limits connectivity in Africa. Then, of course, the restrictive visa policies. And I like us to take note of this. 75% of African population needs visa to travel. 75% of the population needs visa to travel. And this is from the United Nations World Travel Organization, Visa Openness Report, of which more than 40% require traditional visa. You must go physically to the embassy. So maybe 60% will have access to e-visa, which you can process, or visa on arrival. But the traditional visa is that you have to go to the embassy, fill out the form, appear and say everything about your grandfather before you get a visa. Now, unequal pace in the implementation of liberalization among the countries is also a key limiting factor. And of course, the lack of commitment by the states to single African air transport market, or what we call let's move on because of my time. Now, so we need to improve liberalization in Africa. And how do we do this? Let's appreciate the size of the country, the continents, and each country. Let's look at the geography and the demography we have in Africa. Interestingly, demography is very key. We have, in the past, people used to say Africa has the older demographic population, but now we have even the mid-size demography. And these are the vibrant young individuals who want to move from point A to point B, and they must be encouraged. Of course, the ease of doing business as promoted by this administration is very key and central to connectivity within Africa. So we need to eliminate the barriers, the non-physical barriers and the restrictions. We need to get the fifth freedom traffic rights in place. It must be. That will enable us to fly as we so wishes within the resources available by, airlines who are so designated to operate. Capacity must increase. Traffic regulations must be harmonized. Designations must be allowed. In Nigeria, it's a major issue, and I don't want to go into this debate. People are saying we have multiple designations. Maybe the panelists will ultimately talk about it, but I'm not biased, but I'm saying that, look, designation, whether it's a single designation or multiple designation, the important thing is that we must allow the country to designate airlines to operate into our countries in Africa. Of course, cargo flights must be encouraged because Africa has the potential to feed the rest of the world, and we know that now. So, we need to develop the framework, and that's what the civil aviation across the entire African countries are doing now through AFCAC. We need to also establish performance index, key performance index, especially to ensure that there is compliance to the various KPIs as designed by ICAO and domesticated by each state. So when we talk about the African civil aviation policy, we should review it to ensure that it's domesticated to what is applicable to us. We must support and provide member states to boost their EL score. The EL score is an interesting score. It is an ICAO score which measures the state of safety oversight, capability of every state, and the degree of compliance. And this is very important. Now, so it's not just designating and liberalizing the air transport and allowing everybody to come in, but what is the degree of safety oversight, capability of the state that you are operating into, and what is the degree of compliance by the airlines operating into that state as well. Of course, technical assistance must be provided. So this is what we have in Africa right now. As of 2022, about 95 or let's say 96 million passengers are carried. 2.1% of its passengers compared to the global traffic. 36.8% of it is cargo. About $63 million is contributed to the GDP by air transport in Africa. Air transport in Africa is employing 7.7 million people and 71.6 passengers as a load factor. This is quite good. We're cascading to growth, but it must be fully supported by initiatives such as the single African air transport market that we have. What do we have for tomorrow? With increasing population, with increasing trade, with increasing GDP per income, and the ease of doing business, which of course will become easier travel conditions. Not that we won't have visa, but less cumbersome visa procurement. We're going to have more affordable air travels, more trade, more connectivity. The environment becomes more leisure for travel. And of course, it will promote tourism as well. And ultimately, the growth will be obvious. The intra-African volume will increase by 51% according to IATA. And the average fares will definitely drop by 26%. So we can clamor for drop in airfare, but we need to do certain things to ensure that these airfares drop. That's what we're saying. Now, let's quickly look at this. 145 country pair receiving direct service and frequencies on existing routes out of Africa. That's about 27%. We can do more. If you recall earlier in one of my slides, I had said we have 600 country pairs where African airlines and countries from outside Africa fly into Africa and fly out of Africa. But of course we can increase this number. So enhancing connectivity across the continent would definitely lead to sustainable development of aviation and tourism. And of course, the airlines platforms will have to bring in more value addition to the passengers. They must be able to fly, and they must be able to have what you call, passenger experience that is satisfactory, that exceeds even the expectations of the passengers. Ultimately, African GDP will grow. We need to examine the relationship between the level of connectivities and the key economics, and of course the investment flow and tourism and trade in Africa. We also need to understand the connectivity, especially as it involves the levels of intra-African connectivities across the countries and cities. So that is where multiple designation becomes very important. So when people say, oh, why is this airline flying to Abuja and flying to Lagos? It's not just because the airline is so desired, but there must be, in economics, what we call the pull factor. There must be a pull factor. Why is South African Airways flying to Abuja and Lagos? Why is Nigerian airline flying to only Joburg? Why are they not going to Cape Town? There has to be a pull factor, and that we need to understand to appreciate the connectivity. The forecast is very obvious. Travel to become greener and become more efficient. What's the way forward? Let's go to the way forward. I've talked about all of this, so let's just move quickly to the way forward. Collaboration and coordination among airlines is required to unlock the market in Africa. African airlines must promote and they must advocate, not just by lip service, but with all degree of action, the liberalization of air transport within the continent, and ensure full implementations of the Yamoussoukro decision. Liberalized air service should be complemented with reforms, and we've talked about that, visa reforms, for instance, to help promote, travels such as the Rwanda experience, where you can just wake up and decide to go to Kigali in Rwanda, and on arrival, you get your visa. Interestingly, we're saying that all eligible African airlines should test the functionality of the market, especially the 35 countries that have signed the single African air transport market today. And we can also, employ others to sign the single African air transport market. In conclusion, we need to accelerate infrastructure in our airports. If you're talking about liberalizing the air skies, airlines have to operate into the airports. We need to accelerate infrastructure development. So we have to prioritize our investment in aviation. And of course, this investment includes airport investments, air navigation investment. Talking about air navigation investment, people have migrated from terrestrial to satellite navigation systems. What are we still doing with terrestrial? So we have what we call the RVS, as a reduced vertical separation minimum. All of these are satellite-based systems that we have to invest in. And when we do, it will enhance air safety and, of course, increase traffic. We have to harmonize our regulatory framework. We have to promote stakeholders' collaboration. The environment is key. Sustainable environment is very key. And for airlines in particular, we want to ensure that we take initiative to mitigate anything that can lead to, of course, reduction in air transport growth in Africa. We want to expand the air transport market by encouraging public-private partnership initiative. This is very key. The government cannot do it alone. So if you have the resources and you meet the requirements from the Civil Aviation Regulation, you're encouraged to invest in air transport in Africa. Africa is still the least connected region by air in the world, ladies and gentlemen. And being the fastest growing continent, as we all know it, with a huge population, 1.46 billion, we're saying that, look, the need to improve air connectivity cannot be overemphasized. All of us need to join and support the single air transport market initiative by the African Union. Of course, it is estimated that frequencies on existing routes will increase by 27% if we liberalize fully. Within the context of Africa African Civil Aviation, African Continental Free Trade Area, it is expected that SATAM will also definitely compete with the countries in Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to use this opportunity to thank Mr. Tony Unachukwu and his team for giving me this rare privilege to make this presentation. And I do sincerely believe that this is the way to go if we want to increase air transport in Africa, if we want to enhance liberalization in Africa, and use air transport to create prosperity for the rest of us in Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir.